My husband, Harrison, believes his reflection is the most valuable thing in our Dallas estate, but he is about to learn that a mirror provides no warmth when the house starts to burn. I have spent decades being the invisible foundation for his monument of vanity, and now I am ready to watch the structure crumble. He thinks he is the one who holds the power because he brings home the larger paycheck, but he forgets that I am the one who knows where every single lie is buried. At 60 years old, Harrison is a silver fox who spends more time at the gym and the esthetician than he does in our shared reality. He walks through the streets of Dallas with the practiced gait of a man who knows he is being watched, and he expects me to be the grateful audience for his endless performance. I used to think that cheating was a sickness of the weak or a symptom of the depraved, because I saw what my father's infidelities did to my mother. I swore I would never be the woman who looked for comfort in the arms of a stranger. But Harrison has spent the last year teaching me exactly why the heart begins to wander when it is left in the cold for too long. Our life in the high society of North Dallas is a carefully constructed lie, where the appearance of success is more important than the substance of our connection. Harrison is fit and tall with those piercing gray eyes that seem to capture the attention of every woman in the room, and he is never shy about telling me exactly how much interest he generates. He treats his attractiveness like a currency that he is constantly counting in front of me, while reminding me that I am merely okay. I am a shorter woman with brown hair that shows the silver of my age, and I have never had the desire to starve myself into the shape of a socialite. I met Harrison when we were both young, and he was struggling to find his footing in the world of corporate law. I was the one who worked 2 jobs to put him through his final years of school, and I was the one who believed in him when he had nothing but a handsome face and a mountain of debt. He told me he loved me 2 months into our friendship, and I believed him because I thought he saw the strength of my character instead of the utility of my support. The shift happened gradually, like the slow erosion of a cliffside, until I woke up one morning and realized I was standing on the edge of a void. Harrison began to talk incessantly about the glances he received at the country club or the way the younger associates at his firm would linger at his desk. He would recount these interactions with a smug satisfaction, and when I remained silent, he would ask if I was jealous or if I simply didn't care about his success. I wondered why he needed his ego stroked by every passerby when he had a wife who had given him 30 years of loyalty. My ego never required the validation of strangers, and I found his need for external approval to be both exhausting and pathetic. We had always agreed that betrayal was the ultimate sin, but Harrison found a way to betray me without ever touching another woman. He started spending his evenings hunched over his phone with a glow reflecting in those cold gray eyes while he ignored the dinner I had prepared. When I would try to sit near him, he would shift away as if my presence was an intrusion on a private world. The suspicion began to rot my peace of mind until I finally did what I thought I would never do and looked through his messages while he was in the shower. I didn't find another woman's name, but I found something that felt even more insulting. He had been engaging in long and graphic exchanges with an artificial intelligence program designed to simulate a submissive and adoring mistress. He was pouring his desires and his secrets into a digital void because a machine would never ask him to be a better man or remind him of the sacrifices I had made. He had replaced our intimacy with an algorithm that told him exactly what he wanted to hear. When I confronted him, he laughed and told me it wasn't real cheating and that I was being hysterical. Then he turned the tables and accused me of being the one with the wandering eye because I had dared to invade his privacy. The rejection felt like a physical weight in my chest during that humid Dallas summer. I stayed because 60 years of life makes you hesitant to burn down the only home you know, but the fire was already smoldering in the basement. One Saturday morning, after a particularly cold night where he refused to even look at me while we were in bed, I decided I needed to breathe air that didn't smell like his expensive cologne and his cheap excuses. I left the house while he was still asleep and drove toward a small coffee shop in a part of the city where the socialites rarely ventured. I wanted to be a ghost for a few hours, and I wanted to remember what it felt like to be a person instead of an accessory to a silver fox's ego. The morning air in Dallas was already heavy with the promise of heat, but the coffee shop was a sanctuary of cool shadows and the smell of roasted beans. I stood in line and watched the sunlight filter through the dusty windows, and I felt a strange sense of liberation in being alone. When I reached the counter, I ordered a large iced latte with extra milk and a single sugar, along with the largest cinnamon roll they had. As I reached for my wallet, a man stepped up to the register next to me and waited for me to finish. He had a thick accent that spoke of Cuba and a smile that reached eyes that had actually seen the world. He told me that it was funny because he always ordered the exact same thing, and he asked the barista for a packet of sugar while looking directly at me. There was no calculation in his gaze, and there was no sense that he was checking his own reflection in the window behind me. We ended up sitting at a small wooden table together, and for the next hour, the world outside that coffee shop ceased to exist. His name was Raphael, and he worked on the vintage trains that ran through the heart of the state. We spoke in Spanish because it was a language I had learned as a girl and had rarely used with Harrison, who found it beneath him. Raphael talked about the grit of his work and the beauty of the machinery, and he listened to me with an intensity that made my skin tingle. He didn't talk about the attention he got from other women, and he didn't mention his fitness or his status. He talked about the struggle of starting over in a new country and the fire it takes to keep going when the world tries to extinguish you. For the first time in a decade, I felt the flutter of something dangerous in my stomach. I realized that I was hanging on his every word and that I was leaning in closer just to catch the scent of cedar and honest sweat that clung to him. He told me I was beautiful, and he said it with a conviction that made the hollow compliments Harrison occasionally tossed my way feel like insults. When the conversation eventually turned to my personal life and he asked about my husband, I felt the lie sitting on the tip of my tongue. I could have told him I was a widow or that I was single, and for a heartbeat I wanted to inhabit that fiction. I wanted to see where this connection could go if I wasn't tethered to a man who treated me like a faded painting in a hallway. But the ghost of my mother and the weight of my own integrity held me back. I told him that my husband was fine and that he was probably still sleeping off the previous night. The disappointment on Raphael's face was visible, and it broke my heart in a way I hadn't expected. He asked if we could still be friends and if he could have my number, but I knew the jealous streak that ran through Harrison like a poisoned vein. More than that, I knew that I couldn't be just friends with a man who looked at me the way Raphael did. I knew that if I stayed, I would eventually cross a line that I had spent my whole life guarding. I stood up abruptly and told him I had to go, and I walked out of that shop without looking back. I drove through the streets of Dallas with tears blurring my vision because I realized that I had just walked away from a version of my life where I was seen and valued. I went back to the mansion where Harrison was sitting in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone and complaining that the coffee I had left in the pot was lukewarm. He didn't ask where I had been, and he didn't notice the way my hands were shaking as I put the keys on the counter. He just looked at me and told me that he had been invited to a gala at the end of the month and that I should find something to wear that wouldn't make him look bad. In that moment, the last shred of my hesitation vanished. I looked at his handsome face and his expensive clothes, and I realized that he was nothing more than a hollow shell that I had been filling with my own life force. I realized that the reason I understood why people cheat was not because I wanted to be with Raphael, but because I wanted to feel the spark of life that Harrison had been trying to extinguish. I didn't tell him about the coffee shop, and I didn't tell him about the man who thought I was beautiful. Instead, I began to think about the gala, and I began to think about the legal documents I had helped him draft over the years. I began to think about the way the community would react if they knew the silver fox was nothing more than a man who spoke to machines because he was too cowardly to face his own wife. I wasn't going to cheat on Harrison in the way he expected. I was going to do something much more permanent. I was going to dismantle the life he thought he owned, and I was going to do it with the same cold precision he had used to ignore me. The drive back from the coffee shop through the sprawling heat of Dallas felt like a descent into a world that no longer fit the skin I was wearing. Harrison was exactly where I expected him to be when I walked through the heavy mahogany doors of our home. He was standing in the sun-drenched kitchen wearing a silk robe that cost more than most people earn in a month, holding a green juice and staring at his own reflection in the darkened screen of the microwave. He did not look up when I entered. He did not ask why my eyes were red or why I had been gone for 3 hours. To Harrison, I was merely a shadow that moved within his orbit, providing the necessary gravity to keep his ego from floating away into the Texas sky. I stood there for a long moment, watching the way he adjusted the collar of his robe, and I felt a coldness settle in my bones that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I realized then that my plan to expose his digital infidelity was too small. A man like Harrison can survive a scandal of the heart because he believes his charm is an infinite resource. To truly dismantle him, I had to strike at the thing he valued even more than his looks, and that was his legacy. Our 3 children had always been a secondary thought to Harrison. He viewed them as extensions of his brand rather than human beings with their own struggles. When our eldest son struggled with his residency in Houston, Harrison called him weak. When our daughter decided to teach art in Austin instead of joining a corporate firm, he stopped taking her calls for a month. He wanted a lineage of lions, but he had no interest in the work of raising them. As I sat in the library later that afternoon, I began to look into the family trust that had been established by Harrison's father. It was a massive estate rooted in land outside of Fort Worth, and it was supposed to be the safety net for our children and our future grandchildren. Harrison was the sole executor, and he had always treated the trust like a private piggy bank he hadn't quite decided how to spend. I logged into his private server using the password I had seen him type 1,000 times. I didn't go back to the messages with his artificial mistress. I knew those words by heart now. I knew the way he described me as a dull weight around his neck. Instead, I looked for the financial authorizations he had been drafting over the last 6 months. What I found was a betrayal that made his digital wandering look like a playground crush. Harrison was in the process of restructuring the entire family trust. He wasn't just hiding money, he was systematically erasing our children from the inheritance. He was moving assets into a new entity he called the Harrison Foundation for Male Vitality. It was a vanity project designed to build a chain of luxury wellness retreats for aging men who wanted to pretend they were still in their prime. He was using the money meant for our grandchildren's education to fund a monument to his own refusal to grow old. The depth of his greed was breathtaking. He had found a loophole in his father's will that allowed him to liquidate certain properties if the proceeds were used for a charitable legacy. He had convinced himself that his wellness centers were a gift to the world when they were really just a way for him to surround himself with younger versions of himself. I stayed in that library until the sun dipped below the horizon and the Dallas skyline began to glitter like a tray of cold diamonds. I realized that Harrison wasn't just bored with me, he was done with all of us. He wanted to shed his family like an old skin and start over as a wealthy bachelor with a brand built on the illusion of eternal youth. He had even drafted a letter to his sister Beatrice, who lived a quiet life in a small house in Plano. Beatrice had always been the black sheep because she saw through Harrison's polished exterior, and he was planning to sue her for the remaining portion of her mother's jewelry collection just to clear the path for his foundation's initial capital. I thought about the man in the coffee shop, Raphael, and the way he spoke about his work on the trains. He lived a life of grit and honesty, while my husband lived a life of mirrors and smoke. I knew then that I wouldn't be leaving Harrison just yet. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a clean break or a divorce settlement he could easily afford. I was going to ensure that by the time I was finished, he would have nothing left to offer the world but his fading reflection. I started by reaching out to Beatrice. We hadn't spoken in years because Harrison had effectively isolated me from anyone who didn't feed his ego. I called her from a burner phone and told her that her brother was coming for her mother's pearls and that I had the documents to prove it. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with decades of resentment. Beatrice was 62, and she had been waiting for a reason to fight back against the golden child of the family. Over the next several days, I moved with a precision that Harrison would have admired if he weren't the target. I didn't change my behavior. I continued to be the quiet wife who prepared his meals and listened to his stories about the gym. I watched him preen, and I watched him ignore the texts from our son about the baby's first steps. I saw him delete a message from our daughter asking for help with her car repairs. He was so focused on the horizon of his new life that he didn't see the ground crumbling beneath his feet. I began to funnel copies of the trust documents to a lawyer I knew in San Antonio, a man who specialized in fiduciary litigation and who had no ties to Harrison's firm. I wanted an outsider who wouldn't be intimidated by Harrison's gray eyes or his expensive suits. The betrayal of our children was the fuel that kept me moving. I remembered the nights I spent sitting up with them when they were sick, while Harrison was at the office building his reputation. I remembered the way I had defended him when they felt he was too harsh or too distant. I had been his shield and his accomplice for 30 years, and now I was going to be his executioner. I found a file on his computer titled Exit Strategy. It contained a timeline for the dissolution of our marriage. He planned to serve me with papers the morning after his foundation's launch party. He had calculated the minimum amount of alimony he could pay without causing a public scene. He had even picked out a penthouse in the Turtle Creek area where he would live his new life as a fitness mogul. He was 60 years old, and he was planning a rebirth that required the death of our family's future. I felt a strange sense of peace as I compiled the evidence. Every time he looked at me with that patronizing smile, I just saw another brick in the wall I was building around him. I didn't need to cheat on him with Raphael to feel alive. The act of destroying Harrison was giving me more vitality than any wellness center ever could. I realized that the reason people cheat is often because they want to feel seen, but the reason people stay to seek revenge is because they want to be the last thing their betrayer sees before they fall. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for Beatrice and for my children and for the grandchildren who would never know their grandfather was a thief of their legacy. I spent my afternoons at the kitchen island, surrounded by the luxury of a house that felt like a prison. I would watch the birds in the garden and think about the cinnamon roll and the iced latte and the way the sun felt on my face when I was just a woman in a coffee shop. I knew I could never go back to that moment of innocence. I had crossed a line when I opened that server, and there was no turning back. Harrison came home late one evening, smelling of expensive bourbon and a confidence that bordered on insanity. He sat across from me and told me that he was thinking of selling the Hill Country property. He said it was a burden on the trust and that the kids wouldn't want it anyway. He looked at me with those cold gray eyes and waited for me to agree like I always did. I looked back at him, and for the first time in years, I didn't look away. I told him that it was an interesting idea and that we should discuss it at the family dinner on Sunday. He seemed surprised by my tone, but his vanity wouldn't allow him to suspect anything. He just nodded and went to his dressing room to admire his tan. He had no idea that I had already invited Beatrice to that dinner. He had no idea that I had already sent the trust documents to our children. Sunday was going to be the day that Harrison's legacy turned into ash. I sat in the dark for a long time after he went to sleep, thinking about the way his father had trusted him with the family's future. I thought about how easy it is for a man to lose his way when he falls in love with his own shadow. The heat of the Dallas night pressed against the windows, but I felt as cold as ice. The stage was set, and the players were in place. Harrison wanted to be a legend, and I was going to make sure he was remembered for exactly what he was. A man who traded his soul for a mirror, and a man who lost everything to the wife he thought was nothing special. The Sunday afternoon heat in Dallas was suffocating, but the air inside our formal dining room was frigid. I had spent the entire morning preparing a meal that looked like a celebration of family unity, while I carried the tools of its destruction in a leather folder resting on the sideboard. Harrison was at the head of the table, wearing a light blue linen shirt that made his gray eyes pop, and he was holding court as if he were a king among peasants. He didn't notice the way our son Thomas looked at him with a mixture of confusion and hurt, or the way our daughter Clara kept her eyes fixed on her plate. Beatrice sat to my right, her back as straight as a poker, and her mother's pearls clutched tightly in her hand. She was the first to realize that the atmosphere was charged with something more than just typical family tension. Harrison was talking about his new foundation again, describing the architecture of the first retreat and the way it would revolutionize the concept of aging for the modern man. He spoke about his legacy as if it were a monument already built in stone, rather than a house of cards constructed on the theft of his children's future. I watched him as he poured another glass of expensive Cabernet and laughed at a joke he had told a dozen times before. He looked so fit and so sure of himself that it was almost impossible to believe he was 60 years old. He was a man who had spent his life winning, and he clearly believed that this dinner would be another victory. He started to explain his plan to liquidate the family property in the Hill Country, and he did it with a patronizing tone, as if he were explaining a complex legal concept to a group of children. He said that the market was at its peak, and that the proceeds would be better served by being invested in his foundation, which would provide a lasting name for the family. Thomas finally spoke up and asked about the college funds for his own children and the trust that his grandfather had specifically designated for land conservation. Harrison just waved a hand dismissively and said that the world was changing and that their grandfather wouldn't have understood the opportunities of the modern age. In that moment, I saw the mask slip. The handsome silver fox was gone, and in his place was a predator who was willing to consume his own young to keep his ego fed. I stood up and walked to the sideboard, and the room went silent. I could feel the weight of their gaze on me. I am a short woman, and I know I don't have the presence that Harrison commands, but I felt taller than I ever had in 30 years. I picked up the folder and placed it on the table directly in front of my husband. He looked at it with a bored expression and asked me if this was some sort of anniversary gift. I told him that it was a gift for the whole family and that he should open it and read the first page out loud. His smile faltered when he saw the header at the San Antonio law firm I had hired. He opened the folder, and as he read the first few paragraphs, the color began to drain from his face. The documents were not just copies of the trust he had tried to gut. They were the formal filings for a preliminary injunction that had been granted by a judge on Friday afternoon. I had frozen every single account tied to the trust, and I had filed a petition to have him removed as the executor on the grounds of fiduciary negligence and self-dealing. But that was only the beginning. Below the legal filings were the transcripts of his conversations with the artificial intelligence mistress. I had printed them in bold font, and I had highlighted the sections where he spoke about his children as obstacles to his true potential. I had highlighted the parts where he called me a dull weight and described his plan to leave me with nothing once the foundation was launched. Harrison tried to stand up, but Thomas reached out and put a hand on his shoulder and told him to sit back down. Clara picked up one of the transcripts, and her eyes filled with tears as she read her father's words. Beatrice took the folder and looked at the evidence of his plan to sue her for their mother's jewelry. The silence in the room was now heavy with a collective realization that the man they had admired was a stranger. Harrison tried to use his charm and his gray eyes to explain it all away. He looked at me and said that I was being hysterical and that these were just drafts and hypothetical scenarios. He said that he was doing it all for the family and that I had misunderstood the legal language. He actually tried to laugh and told the kids that their mother was just going through a difficult phase. I didn't argue with him. I didn't raise my voice or cry. I simply pulled out my phone and played the audio recording of the conversation he had with his business partner the night before. In the recording, Harrison was heard laughing about how he had already moved half of the Hill Country assets into a shell company and how he was going to announce the sale at the gala. He talked about how he would have the divorce papers ready the next morning and how he would finally be free of the burden of a family that didn't match his aesthetic. The voice on the recording was cold and calculating, and it left no room for his lies. When the audio finished, Harrison looked at the table, and for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. I told him that he had 1 hour to pack a bag and leave the house. I told him that the firm had already been notified of his professional negligence and that the Dallas Morning News would be receiving a tip about the foundation within the hour. I watched him realize that his legacy was not going to be a chain of luxury retreats, but a public scandal that would follow him for the rest of his life. He looked at his children and tried to find a spark of sympathy, but they looked at him with the same cold detachment that I had been feeling for months. He was 60 years old, and he was about to be a social pariah in the city he thought he owned. Beatrice was the one who walked him to the door. She didn't say a word to him, but she held her mother's pearls in her hand as he walked past her. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Without his ego and his status and his expensive suits, he was just an aging man with a handsome face that was starting to show the cracks of his character. When the door finally closed, I went back to the dining room and sat down with my children. We didn't talk about the money or the legal battles ahead. We talked about the things we had lost and the things we were going to rebuild. I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me, like the first cool breeze of a Dallas autumn. I thought about the coffee shop and the man named Raphael. I thought about the choice I had made not to lie and not to cheat. I realized that if I had followed that path, I would have been just like Harrison. I would have been looking for an escape instead of facing the reality of my life. By staying and fighting, I had saved my children's future, and I had regained my own sense of worth. I didn't need a handsome man to tell me I was beautiful. I just needed to look in the mirror and see a woman who had the strength to burn down a kingdom to save the people she loved. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal filings and public fallout. Harrison's firm asked for his resignation within 48 hours of the gala news hitting the papers. The Foundation for Male Vitality was dissolved before the first stone was ever laid, and the assets were returned to the family trust under the supervision of a court-appointed guardian. Harrison moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, and he stopped going to the gym and the esthetician. Without the audience for his vanity, he seemed to wither away. I would sometimes see his name in the social columns, but it was always in the context of the scandal. He had become a cautionary tale for the Dallas elite, a man who lost everything because he couldn't stop looking at himself. I never went back to the coffee shop, and I never saw Raphael again. Part of me still wonders what could have been if the circumstances were different. I wonder if he would have liked the person I have become now that I am no longer a shadow. But most of the time, I am just content to be Lydia. I am a 60-year-old woman who is a little bit bigger and a little bit shorter than the socialites in North Dallas, and I have never felt more powerful. I have spent my whole life being the foundation, and now I am the architect of my own life. I realized that the reason people cheat is because they are afraid to face the truth about their relationships. They want a shortcut to happiness, but there are no shortcuts when it comes to integrity. I didn't cheat on Harrison, but I did something much more satisfying. I let him see exactly who I was before I closed the door on him forever. I spent the rest of the summer watching the sunset over the Dallas skyline from the porch of the hill country house that was now safely in the hands of my grandchildren. The air was warm and the crickets were singing, and for the first time in 30 years I didn't feel unappreciated or rejected. I felt like a woman who had finally found her own reflection and found that it was more than enough. Harrison is still out there somewhere, probably still checking the mirror and wondering where it all went wrong. But I am here, in the real world, living a life that is built on something more permanent than a handsome face and a silver tongue. I understand why people cheat now, but I also understand why they stay and fight, and I am so glad that I chose to fight.